Good afternoon, good evening, good morning to SFS alumni around the world. My name is Joel Hellman, and I'm Dean of the School of Foreign Service, and I'm very pleased to welcome you here to another one of our Fast Break episodes in which we discuss those events that are shaping headlines around the world. Today, I am very, very pleased to be able to welcome back to our Fast Break discussion Ambassador Dennis Ross. Ambassador Ross has been a point person for uh, Middle East politics across successive administrations dating back to the mid 1990s and through the Obama administration. Has been involved in negotiating peace deals and peace agreements, has been a trusted advisor to presidents around the world. So it's we're very, very pleased to have Ambassador Dennis Ross. Let me say just one thing about the ground rules for our conversation today. This is a 30-minute conversation, and I will be running those discussions, and I will be monitoring the Q&A function. Uh, if you have a question and you'd like me to integrate it into the conversation, just please put it in the Q&A function, which you can find on the More tab of your Zoom screen. But look, Dennis, let me welcome you here, and let me start with a broad question. Tell us where we are at the moment.
All right. Well, where we are right now is that I think the administration is on hold to resume discussions, not because it wants to be on hold to resume the second round of negotiations with the Iranians, but the Iranians are basically putting a condition on resuming the talks, and that is that the U.S. lift the blockade that it's imposed. I think that is and kind of a natural approach of the Iranians. The Iranians like to stretch out negotiations. They're never in a rush. They want to play for time. It may seem paradoxical to us because they have incurred a high cost in this war. But from their standpoint, they've been taking on the strongest power in the world with the strongest regional power, and they're still there. This leadership is still there. The regime survived the decapitation. It survived efforts to destroy its command control, and it still has its system operating throughout the country. And from their standpoint, they feel that plus the ability to exert control over the Strait of Hormuz gives them leverage, and they're in no rush. Now, the truth is, there's also a divide in the Iranian leadership, but I want to put that in perspective. This is not new. There have always been factions in the Iranian leadership. What is different this time is that the Ali Khamenei, who was the supreme leader from the time of the death of Khomeini in 89 until the beginning of this war, he was the arbiter. You could have factions, he would decide, and his word was final. Now, the interesting thing is he would tilt towards the Revolutionary Guard, but when he thought it got too strong, he would tilt in another direction. His son, at this point, is his successor. We know he's been wounded in the war. We know he seems to be off in a highly secluded place, mostly probably for security reasons. The decision-making process is probably more cumbersome than it's been. What it all adds up to is at this point, the Pakistanis communicated to President Trump that the Iranians weren't prepared to send their delegation. What they said to him at the time was divisions within that delegation were holding up the ability to come at this point. But even though they were saying, the Iranians were saying, so long as you have the blockade on, we're not going to negotiate. I suspect that is obviously a style of negotiation on their part. I still think we will get to round two. The key here, I think, is both sides feel they have leverage. President Trump thinks the Iranians ought to be prepared to negotiate now because we've inflicted so much damage on them. They see him as someone who was willing to allow the Iranians to export their oil when they were preventing everybody else from doing it. And that sent a message that he was very anxious to keep the price of oil down. That meant to the Iranians they have leverage. So they're not in a rush to sort of end this. He will at some point, no doubt, go beyond blockade, and I think do more than just threaten to resume military strikes. My guess is before that happens, we'll have a round two. And the key question will be, can you bridge the key differences there? Those differences in a nutshell are we want to agree on a moratorium for them enriching uranium, which is interesting because it already represents a concession on our part. It's a moratorium, not an end to enrichment. We offered 20 years. They came back with 5 years, which is itself interesting because that's beyond the Trump term. The question of shipping out what is highly enriched uranium near weapons grade, a stockpile they have that is buried right now, to be sure, but amounts to about 440 kilograms, which means effectively about 12 bombs worth. There is another 184 kilograms of 20% enriched, which is also highly enriched uranium. 20% is the cutoff or the threshold. That, I think, is an issue there on which there's a significant gap, but probably also a bridgeable one, which we can get into. The question of the opening of the straits was never an issue before because they never closed them before. But now, having what they see as a real card, they're not so keen to give it up. They certainly may give it up, but if they give it up, they're going to get paid for it. So those in a nutshell, for the president, he wants something he can point to on the nuclear issue. He has to have the opening of the straits. They won't give either away for free. We have put on the table already pretty significant economic incentives. It's not just the Iranians being allowed to sell their oil again. It is also a $250 billion reconstruction fund that would be enabled by our lifting of sanctions. Now, even that, and I'll wrap up this part of the conversation with this, even that is actually something beyond which the president can truly offer. He can offer it, but he can't deliver it because many of the sanctions are legislatively mandated. He does not have the power to lift them all. He does not have the power unilaterally to lift the anti-terror sanctions, which are legislatively mandated. The money laundering sanctions, legislatively mandated. Human rights sanctions, legislatively mandated. And here we may see the Democrats assume a tougher position on Iran than he's prepared to assume. They may not have liked this war, but they can say, well, look, why would we lift the sanctions on human rights when it's very clear we see this what this regime has been prepared to do to their public? So it just adds to the complicated nature of this, which you and I were talking in advance. At an analytical level, it's actually quite interesting, but from the reality of what it's costing the globe and us and the Iranians and the region, it's really problematic.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the leverage that each is employing in these these different aspects of the agreement. So let's talk first about the blockade. The blockade really does reshape and potentially not only what's the dynamics of this particular conflict, but as some of the questioners have raised, it brings China in an interesting way. It brings India in an interesting way. And it has potential, very significant regional and global implications. Tell us a little bit more about what you think the implications are of the blockade, the willingness of the U.S. to lift the blockade. Is this really damaging leverage that can push Iran to more significant agreements at the table?
Look, we did not blockade at the beginning of this war, which is itself interesting. And as I was saying, we were allowing the Iranians to export their oil. Now that created a twofold lever for the Iranians that they didn't have before. They saw how much the president wanted to keep oil prices down, so that told them we have a lever here. And then for the first time, basically, since the Iran-Iraq war, which we did reflagging operations, started with Kuwaiti request to us to reflag the ships in July of 1987. And we reflagged the ships, which did end up getting us into a direct conflict with the Iranians and Khomeini at the time ended the war because he really couldn't fight the United States. Ali Khamenei, was the president at that time, and one of the lessons he drew from that is you don't want to get into a direct war with the United States because that can threaten the regime, hence the whole proxy network that was set up. Okay, so they never made an effort to control or themselves deny access since that time. We imposed the blockade as an alternative to some of the threats the president was making. He understood that the The lever suddenly that the Iranians had is they controlled the access to the Gulf. But by the same token, they also export everything through the straits. They also import everything through the straits. By the way, this is not the export of their oil. This is the import of everything, including food. So suddenly, when there's a blockade, they lose the revenue that they get from their exports, and they also lose access to the imports that they need that are not only essential for their economy, that's also essential for being able to feed their people. So it is a real lever on them, and it is something that will wear on them, and it is a counterpoint to what they were doing in terms of denying everybody else the ability to use the straits.
Now, let's talk about Iran's leverage on the strait itself. You did sort of suggest that there is the outline of a potential deal in
Yeah.
which they gain something which they never really had before, which is control over the strait, and they may demand some financial leverage to reopen it. How realistic is it to think about the long-term security of traffic in the strait as long as you have a hostile regime in place that has recognized the damage it can do by controlling the strait and realize that it's a fairly low-cost way of exacerbating their power. What's realistic to think about short of boots on the ground, creating a buffer zone, which America seems to have very little appetite for?
Look, there really are two different issues here. One is, okay, we can blockade as we've shown, but unfortunately, when we blockade, we impose a great price on them. We also impose a price on us and the global economy. So it's not something we really want to carry out either. But it's better than trying to use force to open it up because if you try to use force to open it up, you are vulnerable to their drones. You are vulnerable to their small boats, what they call their mosquito fleet. Revolutionary Guard probably has close to 1,000 of those boats. Each one can carry a mine. Each one has RPGs. Then they have anti-ship cruise missiles, some of short range, some of much longer range. If you're exposing your ships, if you're exposing your vessels in there, it's one thing. You could argue, and I think with some legitimacy, we probably do have the means to be able to counteract that. But it takes some time, number one, and it's not 100%. So you're a ship owner or you're Lords of London. Uh, you really want to be, you want to lose your ship? You got at least $100 million ship. You really want to take the risk that you can lose your ship? And by the way, what's going to cost you to just insure your ship? So it's a it's a dicey proposition, number one. Number two, the Iranians now know they have this lever. I do believe when this ends, the straits will be opened up again. But think about the following. They know on an arbitrary kind of basis, maybe not immediately, but let's say 3, 4 months down the road, they don't like something the UAE is doing. And suddenly they say, these ships, we have questions about these ships, what they're carrying. Or because we think they have hazardous material on it, we think that we ought to be paid for this. Are we going to war over that? I think from now on, the status quo ante, as it relates to the Straits, is not going to exist. There'll be some level of certainty, and there'll be some who will be prepared as a price of doing business to pay tolls to the Iranians. So I think the reality of the Straits of Hormuz will be different in the aftermath of this war, even if at the end of the war we claim they're now free and open and there will be no disruption. I think in the future, we will see there will be some disruption to normal traffic.
Now, the Europeans have gathered together to talk about the role that Europe will play in keeping open the Straits of Hormuz, not opening the Strait of Hormuz, because it's clear that they're not going to be engaged in this in the short term.
Right.
What do we know about that discussion that just happened, and what realistic role is it for other powers outside the United States to play a role in maintaining traffic through the strait?
First, I think the British and the French in particular have taken the lead on this, and they both disagreed with being a part of the American effort at a blockade. They said, we will not play that role. Part of this, by the way, is when you berate your allies, when you tell them, by the way, we sent an Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, Eldridge Colby, there to say to them before the war, Your responsibilities are exclusively in NATO, in Europe, not outside. And then suddenly, and we don't talk to them in advance. And then the 12th day of the war, the president says, "Where are you? You depend on it more than us." So you berate them, you tell them this is not the area of their operation. They say, "Where are you?" It doesn't work that way, that they're going to be there when you need them if you don't actually build a relationship with them in advance and discuss with them in advance. Having said all that, because it is important to them, because it does affect the global economy, and we're talking not just about oil and LNG, about a third of fertilizers come out of there. A significant percentage of helium comes out of there, and that's really very important for semiconductors. This is a really important choke point when it comes to the global economy. It is true the Europeans are much more dependent upon we are than we are. The Asian, China and other Asian countries are even more dependent than they are. So the Europeans have got about 40 countries that they are talking to about organizing what would be a kind of rules of engagement, who will take part. And I think they will play a role. And I think one of the outcomes of the war will be an international regime to reinforce the idea. This is an international waterway. This is not like the Suez Canal or the Panama Canal. Those are both man-made in sovereign countries. They can charge tolls because these were man-made. This was always an international waterway where there was supposed to be free, uninhibited, undisrupted traffic. So I think there will be an effort to sort of legitimize that again and to sort of validate it with an international kind of presence. I suspect also there'll probably be a Security Council resolution. All of that will be designed to raise the cost to the Iranians of doing what I was saying before, disrupting it. The Iranians, at least traditionally, have not been indifferent to political costs. They don't like being isolated. In the aftermath of the war, they will try to draw closer to the Russians and the Chinese. Again, they will try to see what they can do in terms of building their relationship with India. A little bit of problematic because of their relationship with Pakistan, but the point is they don't like being politically isolated, and that will be one of the things that will be necessary to counteract what I believe will still be a kind of impulse on their part to take advantage of the fact that they still see they have some leverage that they never had before.
Can I ask you about China? A number of questions
Yeah.
have asked about China. What role are they playing now in using their leverage to push Iran to the negotiating table? And given this potential international agreement to keep the strait open, what role do you think China might play in that?
China depends very heavily on it gets 50% of all of its oil out of the Gulf. Uh, that in itself gives them an enormous stake. They had about 4 months reserves built up. They've already used up about a third of those reserves. So they are playing a role right now because they have a big stake, and they're they're not in the lead, but you can well assume that they're playing a major role behind the scenes, supporting what Pakistan is doing and communicating to the Iranians that they want this to end. And the Iranians cannot be indifferent to the Chinese because, first of all, 90% of the oil they sell to China. Secondly, China has been a key provider of a variety of dual use items, which they will need not only to rebuild their civilian economy, but they're going to need if they want to rebuild their defense industrial base. China has been a key to providing them the precursors for what they need for solid fuel for their ballistic missiles. They can't easily say no to China.
Well, look, I want to now shift the lens to another aspect of this crisis, which is what's going on in Lebanon. Israel's attempt to create a buffer zone in Lebanon, the bombing of southern Lebanon. There's a 10-day ceasefire, but Trump has suggested otherwise in his tweets about Israel's
Right.
role in Lebanon. Give us just a status update of what you think the Israeli intentions are in Lebanon. Will they follow Trump's threats to not continue bombing southern Lebanon and actually controlling territory in southern Lebanon?
Look, I'm going to look at this from two aspects. The domestic Israeli aspect is, by the way, this is not just Bibi Netanyahu. There is the October 7th overhang. There is a psychic consequence of that. Uh, there is a no surprise doctrine now. And of course, no one can guarantee no surprises. So what does that build? It builds an impulse towards preemption on the one hand and the value of buffer zones on the other. The instinct is to keep a buffer zone in South Lebanon until you have a Lebanese government that can demonstrate it can disarm Hezbollah. Now, the disarming of Hezbollah, the Lebanese army doesn't have a whole lot of credibility with the Israelis right now because they claim they cleaned the area south of Litani, and it became evident very quickly when Hezbollah began firing into Israel in the aftermath of the killing of the supreme leader. It became clear pretty quickly a lot of these missiles came exactly from the area below the south of Litani. So there's an impulse to sort of clean that again. On the other hand, President Trump basically acceded to the Iranian request or the Israeli Iranian condition that the ceasefire included Lebanon. Initially, he said it didn't, Bibi said it didn't, and then he imposed it on Netanyahu. Netanyahu cannot say no to Trump, flat out, cannot say no to Trump for a lot of reasons, but I'll give you one that people may not be thinking about. There'll be an election in Israel no later than October 26th. Bibi desperately wants Trump to come and campaign for him. He believes it makes a difference of 2 or 3 mandates. So he can't say no to Trump and he won't say no to Trump. But it comes back to the whole reality of will we have a second round of negotiations? Will that second round of negotiations lead to, in my mind, the most likely outcome is an open-ended ceasefire with an agreement to continue to negotiate over elements of what hasn't been finalized, especially in my mind, what I think will be in the nuclear area. I want to add one other point here. You do have direct Israeli Lebanese negotiations for the first time since the 1990s. And that's significant because you also have the president of Lebanon saying they're prepared to make peace with Israel, not just to have a ceasefire, not just to demarcate the border, but to have peace. There is a law on the books in Lebanon that makes it a crime to meet an Israeli. So one of the early things we could see as a result of these talks is the revocation of that law. Uh, so there is an interesting potential, and it comes back to what I was saying about buffer zones. The president of Lebanon can't do a deal with Israel so long as Israel is occupying territory in Lebanon, even if it's for an explicit defensive security purpose. That actually tends to re-legitimize Hezbollah in Lebanon because they'll say we're the only ones who are prepared to resist the Israelis. They lost their legitimacy because they launched against the will of the vast majority of Lebanese, including most of the Shia population. They fired in response to the killing of Khamenei. Well, that might be an Iranian interest, but it wasn't the Lebanese interest. So the longer Israel keeps a buffer zone, the more it allows Hezbollah to reestablish a sense of legitimacy. So you're caught up in what is, I think, a set of conflicting kinds of objectives. But because Bibi can't say no to Netanyahu, because the Iranian leadership will insist that there has to be a ceasefire there, because Hezbollah needs it, that gives you, at least gives me some sense of a possibility that we could see an advance there. One last point on this. I don't see an Israeli withdrawal before the Israeli election. Bibi will not want to be charged with having failed there. The people who live in the northern part of Israel were told to stay this time. After October 7th, they were told to evacuate. This time, I mean, before the resumption of the war, people moved back. Not everybody, but people moved back. This time, when the war broke out, they were told to stay. So you have to provide security for them. And the longer the ceasefire goes on the one hand, that's good news. But if Hezbollah has not been, in fact, completely dealt with in a way that makes it credible that people won't be faced with the threat again, the withdrawal would be a political liability for Netanyahu before the election.
Well, look, in the last few minutes that we have, let me ask you to give us some markers or milestones of what we should be looking out for in the next few weeks, because we're really now in a very uncertain, open-ended
Yeah.
situation, right? Where Trump has said there's a ceasefire, it's indefinite. I'm
Yeah.
waiting for something, for some unified proposal. The Iranians have made it clear that they don't see themselves negotiating, although we understand there really is negotiation going on. What are the markers that you're going to look for in the next few weeks to tell us how things are evolving?
Well, look, the first sign that things were moving in a better direction would be some kind of an agreement that we will lift the blockade, and in return, they will open up the straits. If that happens, and I would tell you, if that happens, then I think we're on the way towards not just another round of negotiations, but a ceasefire deal, which I suspect will end up being elongated. You may not have a formal declaration of the end of the war, but you're going to have a ceasefire that is the equivalent of it. It might look a lot like what was done between the Israelis and Hamas, where you basically had a ceasefire and then you had the Trump 20-point plan. We should be looking for, if that doesn't happen right now, when does the next round take place? The sooner the next round takes place, the less likely we're going to have another military round in escalation. If the next round doesn't take place soon, then I expect that we will see a resumption of the war, which in my mind includes not only vis-a-vis Iran, but it probably also means Israel and Lebanon too. So I'm looking for the what happens with the blockade. I'm looking for, do we have a round two? And if we don't have a round two, then I'll look to see. I don't expect the president to carry out his threats to end civilization in Iran. I think the strikes will be more limited, and then I think we'll see another round in the aftermath of that. That round may bring this to an end. Uh, the key thing is, how much is each side hurting? Right now, we're in a game of chicken. Fundamentally, we're in a game of chicken. It's really a test of wills. And regrettably, I think we have a leadership in Iran right now that doesn't feel it has a lot to lose, and it can outlast our pain and the president's readiness to absorb pain.
Is that realistic, though? Do you think that that it can outlast this and it can accept the pain? Is there a point at which it can't?
Oh, I believe there really is a point at which they literally will collapse their economy, and they won't be able to pay salaries. And they have to be able to pay salaries to the besieged and the Revolutionary Guard, the rank and file who suppress the public. Look, one sign of they really are hurting and they have doubts, notwithstanding everything they say, they have brought in militias from Afghanistan and from Iraq to put them on the streets to ensure there's security on the streets and there aren't demonstrations and protests. That says A, they don't trust the public, and B, it says they have some limitations in terms of their own personnel and their ability to trust it. So yeah, you can run out, and if they can't start paying salaries at some point, they're going to have to bring this to an end.
And they haven't really mobilized the proxies in any significant way. Do you see that as another potential tool that they could use in response?
The one key, we're seeing it somewhat in Iraq, by the way, because they have been firing at us there to the point that we are not allowing, we handle their dollar exchanges. We put that on hold right now. They can't, they sell their oil with dollar and they have to do it through the US. And that's put on hold right now as a way of forcing the Iraqi government to do more against the proxies who have been active in Iraq and a little bit against some of the Gulf states. Um, the one to watch out are the Houthis. What do the Houthis do with the Bab el Mandeb? If you can't operate through the Strait of Hormuz and you can't operate through the Bab el Mandeb, there you're talking about a third of the world's oil. I mean, then you're talking about the damage to the global economy looks profoundly worse. And look, one of the biggest shortfalls is going to be jet fuel. I mean, people don't tend to focus on it, but you're going to see the price of travel go up dramatically. It is already in Europe, and routes are going to be canceled. So there's a lot more pain that everybody may experience if this isn't brought to an end sooner rather than later.
Well, on that note, we're going to have to stop the conversation, although there's a lot more we can talk about. Ambassador Ross, he's the Dermont Family Professor here in our Center for Jewish Civilization at Georgetown University. We're very pleased to have you, and thank you so much, um, uh, SFS alumni around the world, for participating in our Fast Break series. We will be back again, I am sure, on this issue, as well as others issues that are at the front of the news. Thanks very much. Great to see you. All the best.